and I have long-term interest in Marxism and Buddhism, and one of the things I'm going to talk about is the intersection of Marxism and Buddhism. This is John Clark, who it turns out is going to speak first. He is an eco-communitarian anarchist theorist, also very active in New Orleans. He's written quite a number of books, two of which he has there. The Anarchist Moment, The Impossible Community. He also writes under the pseudonym Max Caffard, so he can write all kinds of obscene things. And he's done a number of things. John Pittman, who will be here soon, also teaches at John Jay College. Both of us are in the philosophy department. Has done quite extensive work in Marxist theory. He's also co-chair of the union at the school, and has quite an interest in Buddhism as well. So, you're going to go first?
Yes, certainly. Okay.
So I'm going to time you 25 minutes.
And I have a paper. I had, a week ago I didn't have one. I just had 2 eye operations. At first I can't really see you, but for the first time in many years I can actually read without glasses. So eventually I'll be able to see people. But I'm really happy that you're all here. And I think we did talk about possibly letting people go around and say a word or two, but I guess we can wait until the commentators here. So I guess I'll start. I have a paper, and originally I thought I would just talk, but since I wrote it, I'm now going to read most of it. And I hope that it inspires some discussion, because I say what I think it's supposed to do, and it certainly doesn't do it. It'll be up to you to do more, so it might get done. So our panel this morning is called Buddhism, Radical Critique and Revolutionary Praxis. And I want to ask the question what it means to entitle our presentation in this way. One answer is that it implies that we want to know how Buddhism might help those of us who are present here today engage in the processes of radical critique and revolutionary transformation. If this is our goal, we need to pose 3 other questions, which are rather obvious ones. One is, what does Buddhism mean? What does radical critique mean? And what does revolution mean? And I'm not going to be able to answer all those in the next few minutes, so I hope we can talk about them more. And we also have to consider the senses in which the 3 taken together can be practically significant to us here and now, which is where we happen to be. So I begin with a little bit on Buddha. The term Buddha refers traditionally to one of the 3 jewels that are considered the core of Buddhist theory and practice. These are Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, which mean, in one sense at least, the awakened mind, the teachings or truth or nature, and the compassionate community. If Buddha refers to the awakened mind, we must ask, obviously, what it is to which it becomes awakened. The paradigmatic narrative of the life of Shakyamuni Buddha tells us that awakening begins with a traumatic recognition of the real. This is the message of the story of the 4 signs. According to the legend, the young Prince Gautama lived within a palace of delusion, a world of ideological fantasy in which the king, his father, the patriarch, the big other, shielded him from all knowledge of the evils of human existence, and was thus his protection from the real. This myth depicts our ordinary civilized state of delusion, in which the real does not register. As long as we live in the ideological world of everydayness, we live a life of denial and disavowal.
Sorry.
I know, it's a sad thing. It really is. I mean, the life of denial and disavowal. Very sad. In the story, good morning. In In the story, Gautama finally looks beyond the confines of this palace of delusion and encounters a sick person, an old person, a dead person, and an ascetic. This means that he takes the risk of encountering the traumatic force of reality, such as sickness, aging, death, and the real possibility of an alternative mode of existence, a thing that sort of lurks in the shadows of the left forum. His confrontation with death is crucial, since it means that he recognizes that he has not been truly alive. He has been among the undead. And his confrontation with the ascetic is crucial, perhaps the most traumatic of all, since it means that he recognizes that a radical change in his mode of being is a real existential possibility. This shock of recognition is the beginning of his long struggle for full awakening. The story continues, and after 6 years of wandering and seeking, Gautama finally ends up in Bodh Gaya, where he mythologically sits under the Bodhi tree and experiences the fully awakened mind. He now assumes the name Shakyamuni Buddha, sage of the Shakya clan with the awakened mind. According to the story, after having further adventures, he touches the earth to testify to the experience of awakening. This act, one of the most emblematic images in the entire Buddhist tradition, symbolizes that awakening is rooted in the experience of the real of the earth, the real of the natural world. This theme is echoed much later in the Buddhist tradition in the story of the flower sermon, in which a large multitude assembles in order to hear some words of wisdom from the Buddha. Instead, he shocks them, actually all but one, by merely holding up a flower before them and smiling. He didn't need his 25 minutes. One of the core messages of this story is the primacy of the real, which cannot be replaced by our mental constructs, illusions, or fantasies, including the fantasy that we can somehow absorb enlightenment or liberation from some wise teacher or leader. To get back to the earlier story, Shakyamuni Buddha's awakening is immediately followed by a trip to the holy city of Varanasi. On the outskirts of the city, in the dear part of Sarnath, he first teaches the Four Noble Truths, in which the dominant values of civilization and of the egoic self, founded on these values, are demolished, and the Eightfold Path, in which the practice of personal and social transformation is described. As we will see, this sequence means, in effect, that after Buddhahood, the awakening of the mind, comes radical critique and revolutionary praxis. All this, when examined in detail, this is the plug for my book, by the way, The Impossible Community. I just want to, the underlying theme of this is really there's a secret reference to Buddhism. I didn't write about Buddhism very much, but in the preface it tells you that's what it's really about. And it relates very much to the view of these topics that I recently developed in a book called The Impossible Community. There I argue that liberatory social transformation requires a radical break in both theory and practice with the dominant social institutional structure, the dominant social ideology, the dominant social imaginary, and the dominant social ethos. And that further, the crucial step toward achieving this goal is the creation of communities of solidarity and liberation. I think I have a quote from the Buddha later where he kind of says that that's right. I'm going to put it on the back of the next book as a blurb. I see Buddhism as offering the most valuable lessons about how such radical critique and transformative revolutionary practice might be carried out. Buddhist radical critique might be described in one sense as the movement from the ruthless critique of all things existing to the ruthlessly compassionate critique of all things existing. One can get a good idea of the radical nature of this critique from three sources that I would like to mention briefly. At least I'll mention two of them for time's sake. The first is the Heart Sutra, which is sometimes identified as the best known scripture in the history of Buddhism. It reads in part, "Form does not differ from emptiness. Emptiness does not differ from form. Therefore in emptiness, no form, no feelings, no perceptions, no formations, no consciousness. Note, this is a denial of the 5 aggregates or fundamental constituents of all things. No eyes, no ears, no nose, no tongue, no body, no mind, which is a denial of the basic sources of knowledge. No color, no sound, no smell, no taste, no touch, no object of mind, which is a denial of that which is known. No suffering, no origination, no stopping, no path, no attainment, with nothing to attain, which is a denial of the 4 Noble Truths, the way, and its goal, in other words, all of the fundamental principles of Buddhism. We could, in fact, call this the Anarchy Sutra, since its basic message is the negation of every principle or arche. It warns that there are no ideas, beliefs, propositions, or supposed objects of knowledge that can be taken dogmatically, ideologically, or as abstract universals having any reality beyond the limits of experience. The fundamental and anti-foundational Buddhist teaching of sunyata, that all things are empty of inherent existence, is a radical critique of all substantialism and essentialism, and thus means death to all ideology. Moreover, the Dharma, the teaching, the law, the way of truth itself, is described as a yana, by which is meant a vehicle. I really wanted to talk like for 20 minutes on what Zizek says about Buddhism. But that, I gave up. I didn't say anything in here, but he even mistranslates in his big 1,000-page book. He mistranslates yana as wheel, which is a very telling mistake, which we could talk about later. But a yana is a vehicle. It is depicted particularly as a raft or boat that is used to take one to the farther shore or the other side of the river. It turns out that this farther shore is a destination that is a non-destination. One reaches it by merely continuing on the way, but now with an awakened mind, having accepted the experience of the traumatic real. On such a journey, only a fool would carry a heavy raft along. As Zen states it, before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. Would you try chopping wood with a canoe on your back? In fact, we do it all the time. A second notable text that relates to radical critique is the most famous passage from Linji, the founder of the Rinzai tradition of Chan or Zen Buddhism. Linji says, "Followers of the way," if you want, everybody's famous quote, "if you want to understand the Dharma, do not be fooled by others, whether you turn inward or outward. Whatever you encounter, kill it. If you meet a Buddha, kill the Buddha. If you meet a patriarch, kill the patriarch. If you meet an enlightened being, kill the enlightened being. If you meet your parents, kill your parents. If you meet your relatives, kill your relatives. Only then will you find emancipation. And by not clinging to anything, you will be free wherever you go. Note, kill me, please. This is precisely why we have a discussion period scheduled."
Could you repeat the man's name, Rinzi?
Linji or
Can you spell it?
Isuan. It's either L-I-N-C-H-I or L-I-N-J-I. You'll find it both ways. Linji's renowned rant is another attack on sick attachments and abstract idealist views of reality. In fact, it is not unusual for Zen masters to attack mastery, master discourses, and master signifiers. Zen texts are tireless in heaping abuse on those who would substitute some concept or fantasy of a Buddha for the awakened mind that is the true Buddha nature. For Buddha, one might substitute party, vanguard, movement, leader, etc. I must admit that one could even substitute community or affinity group. Delusion has no limits. The great obstacle to communism is communism. The great obstacle to democracy is democracy. And to mention the most notorious of all such travesties, the greatest obstacle to freedom is freedom. I'm going to skip the third example. We can talk about it if anybody's interested, but it's Nagarjuna and the Madhyamaka Prasangika philosophy with the tetralemma in which you affirm, deny, both affirm and deny, and either affirm or deny. These aspects of Buddhist radical critique may seem abstract, as they must until translated into concrete diagnosis and practice. But its core is expressed in something quite experiential, the analysis of suffering and craving presented by the Four Noble Truths. These state that there is suffering, a cause, a cure, and a way to effect this cure. Though its revolutionary implications are seldom drawn out, this analysis is an implicit critique of the civilized ego and of the entire history of civilization and its project of domination. According to the Buddhist analysis of anatman, or no-self, and trishna, or craving, this history has from the outset been the story of an insubstantial subject on an impossible quest for an unattainable object. As long as we remain trapped in this project, we are perpetually haunted by two unanswerable questions. Who am I, and what do I want? This means, in psychoanalytic terms, that as long as we live in world history, we are plagued by what is called in that theory obsession and hysteria. This is precisely what Buddhism pointed out 2,500 years ago. We are a civilization of obsessive hysterics and hysterical obsessives. The project of the ego is to give substance to its own inherent insubstantiality. It is ironically a ghost that is haunted by its own intrinsic lack. The project of the ego is to find an object that will fill up an ontological void, but its expedition is necessarily doomed from the start. It is trapped in the ontic circle. In other words, under civilization, there is suffering, and this suffering is inherent to the kind of ego that it generates, and which in turn regenerates it. History is indeed a nightmare, a terrifying and suicidal fundamental fantasy from which we are trying, if only unconsciously and neurotically, to awake. The problem, as Buddhism has always pointed out, is that we are trying to awake by not awakening. This strategy of the undead just doesn't work. You don't actually get brains by eating brains. As Hegel shows, in part despite himself, the egoic project of self-recognition has been fundamental to civilization. And it's, let me skip Hegel, you probably all know Hegel. You memorized that in elementary school, probably.
Oh, yeah.
If you're a boy Stalinist like Stanley Ronald. So I said these projects of domination are the processes that are questioned in the Buddhist analysis of anatman, or no self. The denial of separate or egoic selfhood. What is the Buddhist non-self? It is the self that is not a self. It is the empty, indeterminate subject opening itself, or its non-self, to a determinate or endlessly self-determining infinity of being. In other words, the Buddhist empty subject presupposes the idea of the transcendence, we get back to Hegel, of the ego. This is what Dogen meant 1,000 years ago when he said that the Buddha way is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self and to find realization in the 10,000 things. As part of this critique, Buddhism, the quest for awakened mind, proposes a revolution in values. Awakened mind, which is mind open to the being and value of other beings, requires the absolute rejection of an abstract, objectified world based on exchange value and the full recognition of the real, living world of intrinsic value. However, the cliche that exchange value must be replaced by use value is at best a partial truth, and to remain fixated at this level of analysis is uncritical and counter-revolutionary. In fact, it's even counter-evolutionary. Use value is a form of instrumental value that necessarily implies the question, use for what end? The awakened mind recognizes the ontological and axiological primacy of the world of intrinsic value. This is what is implied in the Buddhist affirmation that all sentient beings have a Buddha nature, and in the Bodhisattva vow to save all sentient beings. In a sense, the most important question that we can ask of any person or any community is the question of what they hold sacred, what they hold to have intrinsic value. The worlds of both exchange value and of use value, as we have known them historically, are based on the ultimate sacredness of the voracious, all-consuming ego. The Buddha world, the world of awakened mind, discovers a world full of wild, self-generating value, though the self-generation is systemic and interdependently arising and takes place on a level that goes beyond what we ordinarily think of as selves. This world is a world of sacred places and of the sacred earth. As Hakuin states in his famous Song of Meditation, this very ground on which you stand is the pure lotus land. This very body is the body of the Buddha. Hakuin is thinking here about what we call the earth and its inhabitants. He challenges us to think about our way of being and acting in such a world. How do we care for sacred ground? How do we care for the body of the Buddha? We might further ask, how do we respond to those who trample on sacred ground? How do we respond to those who trample on the body of the Buddha? These same ideas have been said in many different ways. The Dharma only states for the civilized mind what our ancestors knew before the beginning of time. Paradoxically, it is also what we all always continue to know and to tell ourselves constantly, though we usually have limited awareness of doing so. As Buddhism recognizes, there is a powerful, critical, and transformative power of the personal and communal unconscious that has radically transformative power if brought to the surface. Buddhism is certainly not alone in affirming this, and it has been explored extensively both by radical psychoanalysis and by surrealism. But Buddhism, and especially Zen, carries further in many ways this inquiry into the dialectical truth of the body, the dialectical truth of the communal body, the dialectical truth of the body of the earth. To return to what Buddhism takes as the noble truths, the desire that it sees at the root of suffering is obviously not simple desire, such as mere indeterminate hunger for mere indeterminate food, which in any case never appears in such simple form. Rather, it is craving. It is compulsive and ego self-regarding desire that is deeply rooted in the social imaginary. Okay, that's going to be right. I have to skip revolution. Let me skip to revolution. As the preceding discussion should have implied, radical critique is an integral part of the process of revolution against the system of domination. However, the quest for the awakened mind has more specific implications concerning the processes of personal and social transformation. Buddhism has a very radical idea of practice, though in a sense it is merely the most obvious concept imaginable. Everything is practice. Everything is practice. It exists at all times and in all places, including what are conventionally thought of as both internal and external times and places. Joshu, the great Chinese Chan or Zen master, and inspiration for Rinzai Zen, was once asked, "Where is the practice hall?" He replied, "Everything everywhere is the practice hall. There is no other place." He says, "This is the kind of person you don't want to meet in the hall. You know, where is the room where the discussion is, you know?" A few days ago, as I was thinking about these issues, I happened to see a quote that someone sent out that helped me focus on what is most central to this issue. This is the quote. "The Buddha's attendant, Ananda, once asked about the importance of having wholesome companions. Ananda asked the Buddha whether having noble friends and companions wasn't half of the holy life. The Buddha replied, 'Do not say so, Ananda. Noble friends and companions are the whole of the noble life, the whole of the holy life.' It's very helpful to reflect on this crucial, if initially perplexing, quote. Buddhism emphasizes the importance of the three jewels of Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, but this passage seems to say that the last of these, the compassionate community, is everything. However, this makes perfect sense. I mean, I totally believe in this. If the community isn't everything, you're not going to do it. But to take it in the Buddhist direction. However, this makes perfect sense. If we approach the matter dialectically, the whole, we then realize, is in each of the parts, which mutually determine one another. One cannot really have an awakened mind or really have the authentic teachings and truth without having the compassionate community. As Western dialectic would say, they are identical. Of course, at the same time, Taoism and Zen would say one cannot have any of them, only have without having. The compassionate community practices the Eightfold Path, which epitomizes the Buddhist practice of personal and social transformation. It would be useful to consider the revolutionary implications of all 8 elements of the path, which we could talk about. But we might just note at this point that it includes not only wisdom and spiritual disciplines, but such practical precepts as right livelihood, which means engaging in a wise and compassionate mode of production. It is significant that the community also practices the 6 paramitas, or perfections. One of these is dana, which means gift-giving or generosity. Though it is traditionally considered to be part of shila, or morality, it is classed separately among the paramitas to stress its fundamental importance. I think that we should see this emphasis as an affirmation that the compassionate community is a community of the gift. Shakyamuni Buddha, like other axial sages, looked back to the gift economy as the inspiration for the future liberated society. He did so just as Lao Tzu, the great Taoist philosopher, looked back to the mythical dynasty of the Yellow Emperor, when communal ties and relations of generosity prevailed. This Taoist tradition, which is with its proto-eco-feminist ethics of care, passed into the heritage of Zen. According to this perspective, the role of the sage, the awakened person, and ultimately of every member of the community, is to defy the patriarchal order and adopt a maternal model of care and responsiveness, to give birth and to nourish, to give birth without taking possession, to act without obligation, to lead without dominating. The adoption of this model, dialectical maternalism, would mean the destruction of patriarchal authoritarian culture, a revolution in sensibility, and a revolution in social ontology. Buddhist ontology asks us to consider how beings appear to us. Do we experience them as resources, as instruments, as actual or potential property, as extensions of our own supposed ego, as sources of power or domination? Or do we experience them, especially in the case of the myriad forms of life, with a sense of wonder and gratitude for the goodness and beauty of being and beings, in the spirit of Lao Tzu, who said, "Heaven and earth combine to drip sweet dew. Without the command of men, it drips evenly over all." Zen, in particular, expressing its Taoist heritage, encourages us to respect the way, the unfolding of potentiality, the striving for full flourishing of each thing and of the multitude of beings, the 10,000 things, as they were called traditionally. All these manifestations of being are manifestations of value, free gifts to the world. The Buddhist ontology and axiology of the gift and of intrinsic value are dialectically identical with a Buddhist economics that is an economics of the gift and of intrinsic value. As Zen texts stated, when we free ourselves from delusion, we find a reality that is beyond profit and loss. We find that nothing is owed and nothing is deserved. We find that nothing can be possessed. We find that there can be no accumulation. We realize that to pursue any of these delusions leads to ruin. In short, we recognize that property is the theft of being. Now, so, as Lao Tzu might have phrased it, what is to be done without doing it? For final thoughts on the meaning of awakened revolution, we might contemplate the implications of the Bodhisattva vow, which says in part that sentient beings are infinite. I vow to save them all. In a world of material abundance, in which over 1 billion sentient human beings live in absolute poverty, the practical implications of having an awakened and engaged mind become ever more obvious. In the midst of the 6th great mass extinction, of life on Earth, the ongoing holocaust of sentient beings, the practical implications of having an awakened and engaged mind become ever more obvious. The sword of Dharma cuts through delusion and cuts the world in one. Thank you. All right. That's all right. Sorry, I was long.
25 minutes.
Okay, I'm going to try to combine Marx and Buddhism, Marxism and Buddhism. But I want to begin with a caveat, which is I have no intention of trying to do the Marx-Buddhist synthesis, or the Buddhist-Marxist synthesis. I'm not even sure that can be done. What I want to do is just explore some intersections between the two. And these are three intersections I'm going to look at. The first is suffering, the second is conflict, and the third is how to think about the ecological crisis. And there are many other intersections one could find, but I've limited myself to that for the sake of the talk. So I'm going to begin with suffering. And here I'll read a little bit, and maybe I'll talk a little bit. Both Marxism and Buddhism are concerned with the nature of suffering and the possibility of its overcoming. For Marx, suffering is caused by the division of labor in all its forms: class exploitation, oppression, alienation. And the possibility of overcoming suffering requires a class struggle to overthrow capitalism and construct a society which would abolish these things. For Buddhism, dukkha, often translated as suffering, has fundamental ontological causes. The illusion of self and the desires, cravings, and attachments generated by this illusion, and the overcoming of dukkha requires the cessation of these desires, cravings, and attachments, and the extinguishing of the illusion of self. Since I'm going to assume that more people at this conference are familiar with Marxist analysis of the division of labor and class struggle and so forth, I'm going to focus first on the Buddhist analysis of dukkha and its overcoming. Now, I mentioned that dukkha is often translated as suffering, but it can also be translated as a sense of unsatisfactoriness, of unease, of emptiness. That life is dukkha is the first of Buddha's Four Noble Truths, but 2 points need to be made immediately. The first is that Buddhism does not claim that existence ultimately has to be dukkha. The whole point of the third Noble Truth, which is the cessation of dukkha, is that it is possible to reach a level of understanding which overcomes dukkha, and that it's possible to attain nirvana in one's lifetime. The second point is that Buddhism does not claim that we never experience moments of pleasure or happiness. That would be absurd to claim that, obviously. Rather, the claim is that even these moments of pleasure or happiness has at its core a lack of substance, and thus there is always a sense of disquiet, a suspicion that there is something deeply unsatisfactory and insubstantial about these moments of pleasure and happiness. Of course, when we don't get what we want, we're dissatisfied. But even when we get what we want, loss or the threat of loss remains an ever-present possibility. Everything that is will cease to be. From the Buddhist perspective, impermanence is a fundamental fact of all existence, and therefore we will eventually lose everything. And we may try to avoid thinking about it, but we know in the end we'll end up in old age, illness, and death. So, holding on to anything is futile. Hence, life has at its core what I might call a deep existential anxiety, the sense of inner emptiness, a feeling that there's no substantial grounding for our existence. For Buddhism, the possibility of overcoming this sense of emptiness depends on a clear diagnosis of the cause of dukkha. And this brings us to the second noble truth, which says that the cause of dukkha is tanha, literally translated thirst, but often translated craving or desire. When we desire something, we want to hold on to it. But since everything is impermanent, this is impossible. The problem then is not impermanence as such, but that the desire that things would be permanent, that things are impermanent, would be permanent. Thus, desire itself becomes the problem. If we do not obtain that which we desire, we immediately suffer. But we may suffer even more when we obtain the object of our desire, for when we obtain it, we experience a hit of pleasure, which leads us to crave that which gives us pleasure, and then to cling to whatever gives us pleasure, and to want even more of it. We are in effect all junkies who continuously crave more and more of the objects of our desires and are anxious about their loss. We just have different substances. And the more we crave, the more we're attached to the object of our craving, the more we worry about its loss, the more we chase after the object that we crave, and thus it is our craving and attachment to the objects of our craving that is the source of dukkha. At the deeper level, the problem implicates our understanding of ourselves. To avoid confronting the sense of impermanence, emptiness, and insubstantiality, we at each attempt to construct something solid, a sense of self, some inner substance, which is permanent and independent, and therefore which separates us from that which is outside us. The idea is this, that permanent, independent, and separate self is an agent which controls our thoughts and actions throughout our lives. In the religious mode, this agent is often referred to as a soul, which will live on even after the death of the body. And indeed, Buddha's doctrine of anatta, no self, can also be translated no soul. For Buddhism, it is this idea of the self or soul which is implicated in all forms of suffering, as it leads us to develop ways to create a false sense of solidity, which we then need to protect against whatever we take to be threatening from the outside, and which animates the desires that fill the emptiness. This idea that we have within us some permanent core, which we call soul or self, is from the Buddhist perspective only a mental formation. There is nothing within us to which it refers. The idea of the self is an illusion, and it is this illusion which fuels the desires and aversions which cause our suffering, desires, and aversions, whose secret goal is to deny the emptiness that we feel at the core of our being. It is not then desire as such which causes suffering, but desire which derives from the illusion of a separate, permanent, and independent self. To put this another way, not all desires are a problem. Desires that derive from compassion, desires to help others, desires for enlightenment, desires for social transformation, which is not ego-driven, does not bring about dukkha. Overcoming suffering, then, does not require the cessation of all desires, but only those which are dependent on the illusion of the self. Unfortunately, for most of us, most of our desires are dependent on the illusion of the self, even those we sometimes call altruistic. Thus, to put Marxist and Buddhist perspective together, while abolishing the division of labor, class exploitation and oppression, and alienation are necessary conditions for the overcoming of suffering, it's not sufficient. As long as there is the illusion of self-suffering, however socially attenuated, suffering will still exist. Conversely, while extinguishing the desires, cravings, attachments, and the illusions of self may be necessary to overcoming suffering, it is not sufficient. And the recognition that is not sufficient has been the basis for what's been called in contemporary times engaged Buddhism. If the idea of a separate self is an illusion, then I cannot separate my suffering from the suffering of others. This is the underlying significance of the Mahayana image of the Bodhisattva, who is about to enter nirvana, and then remembering the suffering of others, takes a vow out of compassion not to enter nirvana until all beings are free from suffering. Overcoming individual dukkha requires that we overcome social dukkha, and this means that we must confront the economic, social, and political causes of suffering. And that brings me to the second part, where I'm going to look at the possible intersections of Buddhism and Marxism, the problem of conflict and its overcoming. Ideas about conflict are often rooted in human nature. Hobbes, for example, argued that conflict is inevitable, given this, what he considered the selfish, greedy, competitive nature of human beings. Marx's view of human nature challenges the Hobbesian assumption. For Marx, while we are innately social producers, more specific psychological traits are constructed by specific historical forms. So the greed, selfishness, competitiveness are the result of the way capitalist societies are organized. In contrast, a communist society, as Marx envisions it, would be an association in which the free development of each is the condition for the free development of all, which in other words means that as capitalism forces competitiveness and enmity between individuals so that one person's gain is another person's loss, a communist society would foster a sense of interdependence and mutual caring through which each of us would strive to promote the capacity of others in conjunction with the development of our own capacities. However, for Marx, while capitalism engenders an intense conflict between individuals as well as between classes, the basic root of conflict pre-existed capitalism. For Marx, the ultimate historical cause of conflict is the division of labor and class exploitation and oppression. Class struggle, then, is the most basic form of conflict throughout history, as well as the most important historical change. And so the communism Marx envisions as the next stage of history would, in abolishing capitalism, also overcome all class divisions, and indeed all antagonistic divisions. Communism, therefore, would overcome all fundamental forms of social conflict. The really existing socialist experiments have not done this, I would suggest. For Buddhism, the ultimate cause of conflict and the possibility of its overcoming is to be understood not only in historical terms, but also as a deeper ontological problem. Conflict for Buddhism is rooted in ignorance, greed, and ill will, which includes hatred and anger. However, while these have been pervasive features of human life throughout history, Buddhism does not accept that they are fundamental components of human nature. In contrast to Hobbes, Buddhism insists that it is possible to transform ourselves by overcoming our ignorance and recognizing that there is no self. This understanding enables us to appreciate our fundamental interdependence and gives us access to what, for Buddhism, is the most fundamental to our human nature, our capacity for universal compassion. And in so doing, greed, ill will can be extinguished and conflict can be overcome. I now want to argue that the overcoming of conflict and the creation of the kind of communism which Marx envisioned requires both a historical approach of Marxism and the existential ontological approach of Buddhism. So first, some general thoughts about conflict. Conflict is often a symptom of some underlying problem, and as such may be something that has positive value. Movements for social justice consciously attempt to bring these injustices to the surface by initiating conflict, whose resolution would necessitate the eradication of injustice. Thus, while it is true that movements of social justice do attempt to create conflict, their goal is to bring a more fundamental latent conflict into the open. Let me make the point in regard to the Marxist perspective. Class struggle is always present in a society in which one class dominates and exploits other classes, as the system of domination and exploitation is already a system of class antagonism, even when the subordinate classes are not politically conscious. In a capitalist society, the capitalist is forced to create profit. And you know most of this, right? Workers turn resisting demands, resisting speed up, and so on and so forth, organize sometimes revolutionary parties. And for all this, the capitalist class and their intellectual agents will often complain that these workers' movements are fostering disorder and conflict. And in one sense, they're right. However, from a Marxist perspective, the goal is ultimately to abolish the institutional conflict built into the capitalist system by overthrowing capitalism, abolishing classes, and therefore class struggle as such. I've already mentioned the three causes of conflict from a Buddhist perspective: ignorance, ill will, greed, and ill will. To say more about them, these three poisons are grounded in the illusion of our being a separate, independent self. Ignorance is ultimately the ignorance of the fact that there is no self. Greed is motivated by the desire to do everything for me and to make everything mine, which, since there is no self, can never succeed. And ill will, which takes the form of hatred, envy, and desire for revenge, is based on the sense that I am separate from others and that therefore these others are a threat to me. Thus, if the Buddhist analysis is correct, the overcoming of the conflict and social solidarity required for the construction of the communist society envisioned by Marx will be undermined so long as the illusion of self is retained. In fact, one of the reasons that the attempt at socialism in the 20th century failed to construct a classless society may well be their failure to adequately confront the illusion of self. To put it another way, the historical construction of society in which the free development of each is the condition for the free development of all will require that we are liberated from the illusion of self. Since the self is my identity, the boundaries that establish it depends on that with which I identify. So ethnic identity, racial identity, religious identity, national identity, gender identity are all forms of social constructs. They each separate groups to which I belong from other groups. The illusion of self, then, can take individual as well as collective forms. Each level of self-identity posits a boundary against that which is not self. Once these collective identities are formed, they open the possibility of needing to protect oneself against the members of the other group, exploiting and dominating the other group, and perhaps going to war against members of the other group. This is the problem which David Loy refers to as social dukkha, and he argues that the three poisons function in a collective as well as individual form. To quote, "Our present economic system institutionalized greed, our militarism institutionalizes ill will, and our corporate media institutionalizes delusion." Extinguishing the three poisons in their collective form will require challenging the power of global corporate and financial capital. However, there is a danger that these struggles will succumb to the siren call of the self. What needs to be added to the class struggle and to other struggles for social justice is the recognition that all self-constructions are illusions, that all identities, social as well as individual, are ultimately false. The attempt to end social dukkha needs to be grounded not in hatred, but in compassion, which arises when the illusion of self is extinguished. And now, in the last few minutes, I'm going to say something about the intersection of Marxism and Buddhism in regard to the ecological crisis. Just one word about the ecological crisis. According to the 2007 Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Emergency, the following is predicted to happen: increase of major storms, deadly heat waves, agricultural collapse, deserts will expand, hundreds of millions will suffer from water shortage, there will be rapid melting of the Earth's ice sheets, oceans will swallow the world's coastlines, including cities like New York, Calcutta, Shanghai, Mumbai, Tokyo, and Hong Kong, Singapore, and London. The world's temperature is already 1 degree centigrade above average. A 2 to 3 centigrades would mean no Arctic ice and perhaps 7 to 12 feet rise in the sea levels. A 3 to 5 degree increase would mean a loss of perhaps 70% of the snow and glacial interests of the world. And I think we're familiar with all the various things. I'm going to skip part of it, of what will happen. But all these things intersect in ways that degrade everything, so that, for example, there's the albedo effect, in which solar energy is reflected from the ice, and once the ice melts, then there's going to be more global warming, and there's more destruction of ecological habitats and more destruction of species, which will lead to further destruction, and so on and so forth. Okay, so these facts are well known, but the world's political leaders do not, while expressing concern, never seem to confront the magnitude of the ecological crisis. So why this fundamental denial? What are the impediments to dealing rationally with the crisis? So the first one is to acting rationally is the global capitalist system. And here I'll just tick off several major problems. Why I think capitalism, the problem of the ecological crisis, simply cannot be solved within the parameters of capitalism. The first is the imperative of profit accumulation. Marx and the Greaser wrote, "Capital is the endless and limitless drive to go beyond its limiting barrier. Every boundary is and has to be a boundary for it, else it will cease to be capital, money as self-reproductive." Second reason is that globalization has its basic mission to convert the entire world to the accumulation process. The whole world of nature is therefore going to simply be a resource for this process. The third reason is to quote Michael Parenti, quote, "Pollution pays while ecology costs. Every dollar a company spends on environmental protections is one less dollar in its earnings." The fourth reason is that the commodity form places exchange value over use value. which has its culmination in financial capital, and financial capital is even more abstract, pure capital, more liquid. It has more need for immediate rewards, which is short-term profitability, and Wall Street is the command center. Pure financial capital becomes a self-expanding machine which must constantly seek ways to overcome any limits which nature would impose.
Now you have
5 minutes, thank you. Finally, this is maybe not finally, one more. As capital can never be satisfied, it forces a constant sense of lack, creating conditions which foster greed and attachment, a variety of cravings and artificial needs, which means that capitalist needs a consumer society. From the Buddhist perspective, there's another dimension which must be addressed. Capitalism both feeds on and reinforces the greed and possessiveness, which for Buddhism is the root of the illusion of the self. Conversely, it is precisely the illusion of our self, of our separate and independent self, which provides the desperation which capitalism turns into profit accumulation, competitiveness, and consumerism. Money in particular becomes a way to avoid dukkha, and at the deep level, a way to evade the recognition that the self is empty, and therefore that there is nothing within us with which we can cling. Money creates a false sense of solidity and reinforces the illusion of an independent self. Since money cannot really take away the sense of emptiness, there's a continuous drive for more money, which is the basis of capital's continuous need to expand. Money, in effect, becomes the ultimate reality symbol. However, since money does not provide any genuine reality, since it cannot fill the emptiness within us, it simply increases the craving and attachment, which produces dukkha. Wall Street feeds on tanha. Thus, there is a reciprocal relation between the motives of capitalism and the existential ontological problem which Buddhism identifies. It is the illusion of a separate and independent self which provides the energy which capitalism transforms into profit accumulation, competitiveness, consumerism, and capitalism in turn reinforces this illusion. Since money cannot really take away the sense of emptiness, there is a continued drive for more energy, hence capital's continuous need to expand, and hence the reason that the ecological crisis cannot be solved within it. However, while the Marxist critique makes it clear that the economic crisis cannot be solved within the parameters of capitalism, socialism, as it is often understood, cannot itself overcome the ecological crisis. The problem here is not just what has been called really existing socialism in the 20th century, most notably Soviet Union and China, which were ecological disasters, but also the anthropocentric, Promethean, and productivist assumptions that were built into classical socialist thinking. The anthropomorphic Prometheus assumptions imply that human beings have a privileged position vis-a-vis the rest of nature and have therefore the right to exploit and change nature fully to their advantage. In effect, that we can conquer nature. The productivist assumption is that production can be unlimited in order to go from the kingdom of necessity to the realm of freedom. Nature then remains a resource to be dominated. And for those of you who like Trotsky, here's an interesting quote from Trotsky in Literature and Revolution. Through the machine, man in socialist society will command nature in its entirety. He will point out places for the mountains and passes. He will change the course of rivers, and get this one, and lay down rules for the oceans. This, it does seem to me, is going to lead to ecological disaster, even more than we have now. What all this means is that the second impediment to solving the ecological crisis is the anthropocentric assumptions, which predates capitalism and will not be automatically overcome with the overthrow of capitalism. And Buddhism, I think, is well situated to address this assumption. I've already discussed the problem of social dukkha and talked about the collective forms as well as the individual forms that it takes. Once these collective forms are formed, they open the possibility of needing to protect oneself against members of other groups, exploiting and dominating the groups, etc. It is often thought that we can overcome this problem once we establish a human identity, identification with all members of the species. But a species identity draws another boundary line between species self and what is not species self, all other species and the rest of nature. If a sense of a separate self is dukkha, as Buddhism claims, then the sense of a collective human species self is the most fundamental form of social dukkha, as it creates a sense of separation from the rest of the biosphere, of which in reality we are a part. This collective sense of separation creates an alienation from the rest of nature, a collective sense of insecurity and anxiety. Our response to this collective alienation, insecurity, and anxiety is to continue to rearrange nature through our technology to turn it into more resources for us, to subordinate it to our will, to dominate and exploit it for the profit of capitalism. Or, in a socialist spirit, to change the courses of rivers and lay down rules for the oceans. Thus, a socialist anthropocentrism would still need nature as a resource to be dominated for the sake of a collective species self. The solution to the problem of individual dukkha is to free ourselves from the illusion of a separate, independent, permanent self, to accept the impermanence of existence, and to embrace our interdependence with others. The solution to the problem of social dukkha requires us to free ourselves from the illusions of a separate, independent self, including our separate species self, and embrace our interdependence with the totality of the biosphere. This implies compassion for all sentient beings, respect for all living beings, and a responsibility for the well-being of the ecosystem which sustains life, and ultimately with the whole of the biosphere.
Hi everyone, I'm John Pittman. I teach here at John Jay College, and I don't know much about Buddhism.
Even after what we said?
So I appreciated this chance to glean some insights from these papers, and especially John's paper with the lovely citations of the ancient masters. I'm a philosopher by training and a Marxist by upbringing. So I'm going to just make a few comments. I hope not to take all my time, and then we can open it up for discussion. I want to bring out first one very crucial point about the relation of radical social critique and Buddhism, based on my pretty scanty understanding, especially of the latter. My remark here might be applicable not only to Buddhism, but to any of the wisdom traditions. It seems to me that John especially has made claims for Buddhism in particular as distinguishing it from other such traditions, claims which, as far as I can tell, have not been substantiated here, and of which I am skeptical. So, basically what I'm saying is that we could probably draw similar sorts of lessons for any radical political activist in today's world from Jewish traditions or Christian traditions, for example. But I could be wrong about that, so I'd love to hear responses. Both Marxism and modern anarchism are initially, I think, grounded in developments of modern European thought and political practice that have a distinctive character relative to more ancient traditions, such as Buddhism. They follow upon a train of material, intellectual, and political developments that include scientific modernity, secularization, and the rise of democratic political movements. I think these contextual differences and the implications of them need to be borne in mind when discussing the relations of the two sorts of truths. On the one hand, of these modern political movements, and on the other hand, of what I've characterized as a wisdom tradition. Another way to put this is to say that while both pretend on occasion to cosmic and foundational truths, the practical import of Marxism and anarchism is primarily as political doctrines and practices, while that of Buddhism is, I think, primarily taken as vehicle of personal and spiritual growth. And I know that you might disagree with that, but I'm thinking about how these things are generally understood in the culture today. This basic difference cuts two ways, I think. First, it makes it tempting to try to meld the disparate sort of insights of the two into some amalgam or tactical alliance. And I take something like this to be the point of both Karsten's and John's presentations. Although John seems to lean more on the side of Buddhism's value as a corrective to some of the falseness of the more practical political ideologies, while Karsten takes more trouble to bring out the value of certain theoretical analyses grounded in Marxism, bringing in Buddhism as a supplement and calling for a strategic alliance. The danger, however, of these efforts at bringing the political and the personal together is this. Politics cannot be primarily about truth or enlightenment, but must be grounded in the perceived interests of parties to common struggles for actual practical change right here and now. Thus, the danger is that in sculpting a pure politics of immaculate vision and righteous application, we run the risk of refusing to dirty our hands and consequently of getting nothing or less than we had hoped done. And I think an example of that might be seen in Occupy Wall Street. But I won't say anything more about that now, but I'll go on. Well, I mean, basically, there was a tendency in Occupy Wall Street to try to resist a kind of practical politics that was situated in where things are on the ground in America today. And I think that I would never say that that was the reason that Occupy Wall Street failed, because first of all, I don't think that Occupy Wall Street failed. I think Occupy Wall Street was a tremendous boon and push to American politics at the time. And I think probably the main reason it failed was because of state repression. But it is also true, I think, that a kind of emphasis on a certain kind of purity was a problem. And this is not only true for Occupy Wall Street, I think this is true for many political movements. And my worry is that trying to bring Buddhism in is going to exacerbate that tendency rather than ameliorate it. So as usual, there are too many things that need doing, too many tasks confronting us. Karsten mentioned global warming and climate change, growing inequality, poverty, and various forms of suffering inflicted by political and economic elites. The point then is to think strategically and to think tactically. I won't deny that what I have in mind is a political project. I think we're all agreed about that. We're all here at the Left Forum. But it must also be something more because of what John and Karsten have said, what they seem to share, and attempt to supply the something more that I just alluded to. I will counterpose to their mutual focus a targeted and tactical response. And my target is the insubstantiality of the self, the illusion of the self. That's my target. I think there's a problem with the idea that the self is an illusion. First of all, I would not want to deny the value and importance of the claim if taken in an absolute or cosmic sense. But relatively, I would assert its falsity, its delusional character even, its dangerousness, politically speaking. Backing up for a moment, however, I would like to make the following clarification. Cosmically, in relation to the life of the entire system of being, the claim is absolutely true. And John in his paper makes this concrete by mentioning the story of Gautama's confrontation with disease, old age, and death. These are the three natural possibilities of every human moment, which this wisdom seems to be saying are permanent and necessary aspects of human existence. And so, any and every human self is indeed insubstantial in this scheme of things. And again, I'm using the word insubstantial because that's a word that John uses, whereas I noticed just now that Karsten uses other words, separateness and independence of the self. So there's a lot of mushiness there, and that may also be part of the problem. On the other hand, and viewed again systemically in relation to a given social totality, it is less true and might be dangerous to claim that every and any self is insubstantial. Why? Consider the following interpretation of such a view. I know the world is going to hell, but I am only one person, and an insignificant one at that. I am powerless to change things. A pretty prevalent view in our world. That is a commentary premised upon one way of taking the idea of the insubstantiality of the self. I take it we can all see how that is a dangerous way of understanding this conception. But I should also like to bring out the more fundamental reason for this criticism. One way in which the claim about the insubstantiality of the self gains traction is by taking as a premise a specific naturalistic and individualistic conception of the self. Perhaps a better way of saying this is to say that behind a most plausible account of the Buddhist doctrine is an essentialist or metaphysical conception of the self or ego. If the self is a somehow pre-existing and original atom of spiritual substance, then the Buddhist critique, as John calls it, is indeed apt. There is no such a self, and the critique of it carries the day. But that is not the only conception of the self that might be advanced. Another way of looking at the self is as a social determination, and one specifically engendered by a dialogical or dialectical social reality. This could again bring up the name of Hegel here, or Rousseau for that matter. Each of us is a self, but one that first of all does not owe its distinctive determinateness to any pre-existing natural or metaphysical essence, and secondly, one we have not completely authored ourselves, but has come about through a process that we have only been partial participants in. In this sense, we are substantial selves. Substantial as much in the sense that there are depths to us that we must tirelessly struggle to understand and get a grip on, and in the sense that we have capabilities to act in ways that can transform our own being and, as well, move in concert with others to effect practical change in and of the world. So, I think the idea of the insubstantiality or the falseness of the separate and independent reality and existence of the self, I think is problematic. It's not only problematic theoretically, but I think it's also, it is in fact something that in some way or another is fed by some tendencies in modern society, in contemporary society. And I think that it's not one that I think is particularly fruitful to embrace as a way of grappling with the immediate current problems of political practice in America today. So I'll just stop.
And now I think we should turn it over to you. Maybe what we can do is take 2 or 3 comments, questions, and then go back to the panel and take another 2 or 3 comments, questions. We ask, though it can be comments as well as questions, that you try to keep it short, being mindful of the fact that there are a number of people in this room who may also wish to participate, so that you don't cause too much dukkha in others.
Could anyone on the panel try to relate your theories and rather abstract talks to any actually existing Buddhist political movements in the world today in various countries, such as the Buddhist-inspired resistance in Tibet or Burma, or well, there's one that I'm very familiar with that claims to be Buddhist-inspired. That's the Komeito Party in Japan, the 3rd largest political party. But and you know, they are originally based on the Nichiren sect of Buddhism. However, if you look at that political party today, it's extremely materialistic and corrupt, and I don't think you'd approve of it as any kind of a Buddhist movement. But anyway, are there any actual movements in the world that you could relate to your theories, either approvingly or disapprovingly?
I think that's Japan, by the way.
Yeah.
One or two.
I thought you said China.
Yeah.
Thank you, all of you, for very thoughtful presentations. I wanted to...
Can you speak up?
I said thank you, and then I wanted to build off your last presentation. Maybe ask if I understood what you were saying, because it didn't seem to resonate with me. Like the idea of no self is understood primarily through practice of meditation and analysis, and you find that there is no self. There's only a series of causes and conditions, like Hegelian kind of things that have caused this situation that you have in your life and everyone around you. And that the more that you understand that, the more compassion you have for everyone else, and therefore yourself, and therefore I would think that that is actually more motivating to work with the community and to make change for the better. But you were making an argument that the risk is that people will misunderstand the idea of no self, and that and therefore it's potentially hazardous to posit this. But to only really have an understanding of it, you have to actually practice mindfulness and look at yourself and look at what this delusional idea really is, and what are the composites of it. So I don't understand why, there's lots of things in life where people misunderstand or get it wrong, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't advocate them, or that it's dangerous that people might go off on the wrong track. So I just wanted to put that out and maybe ask you to.
One more?
This may be a little off track, but I'm going to give it a shot. For the most part, left-wing people tend to reject religion in any way, shape, or form. I'm sorry, now you can't hear me?
Right.
Okay. I was going to say, for the most part, left-wing people, including myself, to a degree, shun religion, especially if it involves God. You really didn't bring up the issue that Buddhism really doesn't drag God into it, which is one of the nice things about Buddhism for me. Anyway, as to whether, I think one of the things, so that's like one thing you didn't mention at all, except that I did miss your talk, which I got lost. And the policeman brought me back. Anyway, Anyway, what is my point? So that's sort of my point. To mention something about God, and I guess my idea would be that an enlightened being, so to speak, would also be enlightened enough to see that there are things wrong in the society in which we live, and we need to work together to do something about it. Whether they have to go through Buddhism to achieve that is another question, but Buddhism certainly has a lot to offer in terms of, you're saying something about, getting rid of the self, getting rid of the ego, but at the same time, you have to have one to get rid of in the first place. So we all were born and we're nurtured, and we do create ego. So, as to whether we want to get rid of that completely and become, sages in the woods, that's another story. But I think something should be mentioned about God. He or she or it.
The three kinds of topics.
Yeah. They're really excellent questions. It's kind of overwhelming. There's already so much to talk about at the same time. Maybe two things I'd like to focus on. One is perhaps my view of what's primary, and my view of what's primary is what you can do with this. What can it mean to you? I'm very much interested in people forming communities of solidarity and liberation. They don't have to go under the name of Buddhism. I mentioned Taoism. I've worked very much in the anarchist political tradition. I'm very much influenced by dialectical thought, other left traditions. The question to me is, what can we learn from each of these traditions? Buddhism has a lot to teach us. I react to the concept of some mushiness of the concepts. We have to distinguish between theory and practice in some ways. Buddhism is a very highly developed analytical philosophy. I don't come out of analytical philosophy, in fact. But what I like about Buddhism is it's highly analytical and highly dialectical at the same time. But there is a very careful analysis of what it means when you use the word self. When you think of self, what are you referring to? There's the theory of the skandhas, the aggregates. What are the elements of the self? And of course, this is an evolving theory. But there are thousands of years of analysis of the self. And I think it's important to look, including contemporary philosophical analysis of what people mean by self, ego, etc. There's also a lot of psychological analysis. What's going on? There's Epstein did a book called Thoughts Without a Thinker, I believe, on Buddhist psychology, dealing with these questions in a very specific sense. So if we want to talk about that, I think we have to look at it specifically, not in vague generalities. But on the one hand, we can have a very sophisticated analysis of the self, but we also have the question of what people experience and what kind of practice they have. This is why the Sangha, or the community, is so important. What processes do we have to go through to discover in our own life what ego or self means? And what do we do to get beyond the limitations that history has imposed on us through the constructed ego, this phenomenal reality, which is not a substance, not an essence, but is a phenomenal reality. I didn't discuss Nagarjuna, who's a very analytical philosopher, but he makes a distinction between conventional truth and ultimate truth. If we use a word, we should be very careful about what it is to which we are referring when we use that word. We have to know what our concepts are all about. But we also have to realize the difference between using a concept that has a reference to certain convergence of qualities, let's say, and talking about ultimate reality. And I'm really, this idea of the murkiness really urges me to talk about things like what emptiness and dependent origination or dependent arising mean. Because it's a theory about ontology. It's about the nature of things, and it's about the way things really are, and our illusions about those things. So it's a very critical and analytical philosophy. But my main interest is on the community. We have to break out of this, one-dimensional society, to coin a term from a dialectical thinker. Right now, we are dominated by a certain social imagination, by a certain social ideology, by an ethos that pervades the left forum and every other element of this society. What are we going to do to break out of it? It seems to me that the kind of practice that Buddhism has been experimenting in for 2,500 years can help us in many ways. It doesn't mean we reject other traditions. You know, I made references to indigenous traditions, to other wisdom traditions, to other philosophies. We have a common history. We have a common intellectual heritage and social heritage. We have to figure out what we can learn from all those sources so we can finally create the kind of communities. Occupy, I think, was a step in this development. It didn't fail because we have no idea what kind of formation people went through in that historical moment, how they were transformed personally, intellectually, psychologically, and what they will do in the next historical moment when that experience comes into play. So that means Occupy is not a thing. Occupy cannot be reified, objectified. Occupy was a moment in processes of historical development. That's what a dialectical analysis has to comprehend. So those are some of the things that I think when I hear these kinds of responses.
Yeah, I'll address a couple of things. One, following John's comment, I would add that it's not just, Buddhism is not just a serious analytic tradition, a philosophical and psychological tradition. It's also a tradition with lots of internal debates, so that there's not really, we're presenting it as though we're talking about Buddhism. There are many kinds of Buddhism, and the different forms of Buddhism debate with each other and debate really seriously with each other. And even the question of self is debated, how that is understood. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done, but I would take exception to the idea that Buddhism is a wisdom tradition, at least in the way that that wisdom tradition has a certain connotation of being mushy, of being not really seriously, rigorously systematic. It's simply an idea of how you should live. Of course, Buddhism does have ideas of how you should live, but it comes out of very careful analysis and also a certain kind of praxis, which is meditation praxis. That is a kind of practice, very serious practice. One thing to say maybe that would be helpful in terms of the idea of the self, instead of saying there is no self, one could say there is no self in the following senses. There is no independent self. There is no permanent self. There is no executive controlling self. There is no separate self. In other senses, there may be a self, but the illusion that there is a self in those senses is what in the Buddhist tradition animates dukkha, and I would say animates social dukkha, and provides a lot of the fuel for capitalist accumulation and competitiveness. And in fact, if it continues to exist in the attempt to construct socialism, will undermine socialism. So I think there's a lot of value in that. Having said that, I do think, along with John, that this Buddhism is one of many resources. If you're trying to develop a genuine praxis, connection of theory to practice, then you draw on whatever resources are valuable to do it. So if you meet the Buddha on the road and it's involved and it gets in the way of your praxis, kill him right away. If you meet Marx on the road or Bakunin on the road and it gets in the way,
don't
kill
each other anyway.
And so all the time. So there's that. Let me just address two of the other things that people mentioned. Buddhist movements throughout the world. There's some very interesting examples of Buddhist movements, but Buddhist movements as such can have all kinds of strange things attached to them. In Burma, now Myanmar, Buddhist movements are killing Muslims viciously. That's not what a Buddhist movement should be doing, but that is what they do. In Zen, some of the Zen Buddhists praised the kamikaze pilots because they thought this was a good way of selflessness, suicide for the emperor. I mean, there are all kinds of crazy things going on, some of which are good. There's some interesting stuff in Sri Lanka that's been going on. But I would say that the main issue is how people on the left can appropriate Buddhism, and for people who are Buddhists, how they can use their compassionate understanding of the problems of the planet to engage. And there's a whole movement, primarily in Europe and North America, but also in places like Sri Lanka, which is called Engaged Buddhism. David Loy, who I mentioned, is very involved in a project of Buddhists to work with others to challenge the underpinnings of climate emergency and to engage with the issues of climate emergency and what needs to be done, which ultimately involves confrontation with capitalism. Which brings me to the religious aspect, because what people like Loy are doing is saying we need people of all sorts, including religious people who come from different traditions, and various people on the left to come together and attack the underpinnings of climate emergency. And it does seem to me that Buddhism does have one advantage here, besides the, I think, a very profound analysis of the self. It also does not believe in God. And that's shocking to people when they think of it as a religion. Anatta, Atman, means not only no self, it means no substantial anything, no individual self, no universal self, no Atman, no Brahman, no God. There is nothing there that you can hold on to as the fount of being. And that's a very profound idea, it seems to me, that can help us deal politically and individually with suffering. John?
I'd say no.
Oh, okay. Maybe we'll
So-
take, you want to say anything?
Yeah, I did.
Okay, and then we'll get 3 minutes. We'll get 3 minutes. We have time.
So, I mean, I guess in a way our problem is that we do actually live in the phenomenal world. That is, we live in the world of appearance. And those appearances are not only appearances surrounding us and outside of us, they're also appearances within ourselves, as if, okay, I meditate on a regular basis, and meditation is a sequence of appearances. And those appearances typically take a shape that defy my attempt to control them. And I need to own that, okay? And owning that is acknowledging that there is something here, there is something within me that we could call a self, okay? So that's the first point. The second point is this, that the phenomenal world that we live in is dominated by capital. It's dominated specifically by enormous and growing media corporations and special interests, shall we call them. And they are very good at getting messages out and saturating our phenomenal world with their ideology. Okay? The problem with ideology is you can't fight ideology with philosophy. You can only fight an ideology with another ideology. Okay? So, think about OWS and think about the great achievement of Occupy Wall Street. The 99% that is now permanently a fixture of the English language. Okay? And it has transformed, to some extent, masses' understanding of what the fundamental issue in the United States is today. Okay? That's not philosophy. That's not fine-tuned analysis of the self. That is ideology. And that's what we need if we're going to grow a left and transform this country. Okay? That's why I think. So one more thing I want to say about this. America is built on the self, okay? It's built on the individual self. The individual self that America is built on, however, is the white male individual self, okay? America is very good at elevating the white male. And what does it do to everybody else? What does it say to everybody else? You are nothing.
But what,
Okay? Now wait, just hold on a minute, okay? So we have to be very careful not to feed into that. Okay? We have to be very careful not to feed into that. And that's, I think, one of the problems with elevating to too high a level the slogan. And that's what it is. It's a slogan, the illusion of the self. Okay? And if we're going to talk about slogans, then let's talk about slogans that will have some purchase in the market of ideas in America today, and that will actually be able to move the country in the right direction.
Okay, 3 more. Yes? For a second, go ahead.
First, thank you for the conversation and the debate that's emerging right here. I think it's very interesting, becoming very passionate. I very much appreciate it. And my question, in some ways, relates to, I believe, Sean Pittman, the respondents. But my question is coming more from a place of sympathy rather than critique. And so, an easy way of asking my question is, how do we move from individual enlightenment to collective action? Right? And let me just say a little bit more about that. So, for instance, if we become enlightened and we recognize the Buddha in every human being, I think it'd be easy then to recognize that that person itself is an illusion, and therefore that person's form of oppressive actions, injustice, are also an illusion. And so if that's the case, how do I respond to injustice, to oppression through that lens? And I say that from, I'm trying to combine these two worlds, and I really want to, and I hope you guys can talk about that.
So John, I could not agree with you more that there is a huge danger in a lack of self. And I speak of that as a person who has suffered with borderline personality disorder, which at its core is a profound lack of self resulting in tremendous dukkha. I overcame much of my suffering by practicing DBT, which is, interestingly enough, dialectical behavioral therapy, which incorporates Buddhist practice into it. So I guess my point there is that I just think that there are multiple forms of lack of self. Maybe possibly not all dangerous.
Okay. Gonna move over there.
Well, first, I just want to thank you, all of you, for this really interesting conversation. I've been thinking about this topic in my own way for a while as someone who's practiced Buddhism for, way before my involvement with Occupy Wall Street. And I just want to share my thinking as I've sort of churned it around in my head, which kind of, I think, touches on the things that you've said in terms of Occupy and in terms of Buddhism, and also in terms of God, I think. My feeling is that Buddhism can be extremely powerful, but I do think that you've pointed out a danger, and one danger is that there's actually 80,000 teachings, right? And so it's impossible for any one individual to really grasp all of those teachings, and even, I think, more difficult to try to distill them in, an hour conversation. And one thing that sort of strikes me as like part and parcel with the internal, the debate on the panel is this idea of, within Buddhism, there's an idea of a tension between, a two but not two. Things appear as if they're separate from kind of like these lower worlds that we're born into karmically, hell, hunger, animality, anger. And it takes a constant striving, because we're all going to fall into those places, just being human beings, right, in order to realize any of the sort of higher conditions of life that we sort of idealize in the common parlance of Buddhism, I think. And so I think that one of the problems fundamentally within using Buddhism, which I think can be really powerful, is that, as we talk about it without like a practice, there's inevitably, we're talking about it from these lower kinds of positions that we are all karmically born into. And so it's hard to see the ways in which there's actual interconnectedness. And that's kind of the point of what all the different forms, I think, of Buddhist practice. So in terms of how that relates to Occupy Wall Street, we come to things like even this panel where we can be critical and say, well, we don't want to replicate, like white maleness, but all of the panelists are actually white men, right? And so we come to those things like in this way, right? We're just as human beings in trying to both, press back against those societal pressures. And then we create communities, which you're bringing up, and we create communities in those images. And in doing so, we end up perpetuating the exact thing that we're trying to fight against. And in my thinking, the thing that was most absent from the communities that were created within Occupy Wall Street was kind of an understanding that there's not only a Judeo-Christian perspective. And what I mean by that is that there are strong ideas very rigid ideas about what is right and what is wrong, which is something that Buddhism very much pushes back against, right, out of compassion, out of understanding that those are forms of attachment. So I just want to raise that issue and reflecting on what you're saying and having thought about this just in terms of my own participation and how we can actually transform society. I think just one last point that I've been just turning around, which is Marx really does. You didn't address kind of Marx's ideas about ideology, and Marx really that I think is a really rich area for Buddhism and sort of this intersection with Marxism. Because we're all caught in this world that is elusive, even for Marx. So perhaps I like this idea that we need to kind of pull both strands. One is political and how we operate and how we actually transform things, so that then we experience the world differently, and we transform ourselves because of this idea of the inseparability between self and environment. And, it's just impossible to put all this into words.
Pretty well.
We'll go back to the panel for a moment, and then we'll go back to other people in the audience.
Part of the presentation I skipped was Nagarjuna, who has this tetralogy. In Buddhist dialectic, you should consider the way in which something is not, both is and is not, and either is nor is not. And it's something you can do in everyday life. When you're talking to somebody, people tend to think this is the way it is. But it's always good to say, well, maybe that isn't the way it is. It's also another way. It's both ways. That's a practice. It's a theoretical practice, and it's a practical practice. One of the quotes that I read was from Dogen. To study the self is to forget the self and to find realization in the 10,000 things. In a sense, you find the self in the 10,000 things. And Buddhism can use a lot of different language on this. There's some Buddhists who talk about the little self and the big self. I was a member of a group called the Blue Iris Sangha, and we did recitation, and it was always no separate selfhood. It didn't say... We never said no selfhood. We said no separate. So always think about your connections. All my relations, is what Native Americans say. And Dorothy Lee had a great book, Freedom and Culture. She studied the language and ontology of the Wintu Indians. And there was no separate selfhood. The so-called self or soul was something that was in the tribe, and it sort of condensed in the area of what we consider to be a person. I mean, different cultures have confronted this in different ways. I'm very much interested in the primacy of focusing on practice and community. That to me is very important, but also at looking at how the development of the primary community is related to social movements. And I'm not trying to sell you this book, by the way, and I can send you a copy of the chapter, and it's free if you want to read about this. But one of the chapters is called The Common Good, Sarvodaya and the Gandhian Legacy. And it's half on the Sarvodaya movement in India, the Gandhian movement, which I think I'm critical of it in some ways, but I think needs very careful study in relation to all of the different aspects in which it confronted social problems and social transformation, including the idea of the ashram, not a religious community, but kind of eco-village, which was going to be set up within each village of India. And secondly, the second half of the chapter is on the Sarodaya movement in Sri Lanka, which is, the one in India was primarily Hindu, the one in Sri Lanka is primarily Buddhist, but is inspired by the Gandhian legacy and has an enormous wealth of experience in organization of communities and community projects. These are vast social movements, millions and tens of millions of people. I think there's a lot to learn. My inspiration for this book, in a way, came out of my experience after Hurricane Katrina, in which I was in India actually setting up a program which has been running for almost 10 years now. And I've spent a lot of time with Tibetans, and that's also something that's informed my ideas about community and about cooperation and about politics. Not that I agree with all the politics, leave there, but I worked with a small community of people, a recovery community after Hurricane Katrina, in which a small group of people were living together and spending 24 hours of the day devoted to what they thought was the most important thing in the world, which is helping their neighbors in a time of need and suffering. And I found that was the best experience of my life. It was the most tragic moment of my life and the most awakening experience in my life. And nothing I can do or think since will be the same. That to me was the experience of communism, was the experience of anarchism, was the experience of liberation, was the experience of the Sangha. It's the world I want. I want to be with those people doing those kinds of things in the future. That's the world that I want to see. And some of my friends are actually doing it. You know, we're doing it. We're doing it in the city, we're doing it out in the country. We're doing a permaculture project out on the land. People are buying up cheap property in devastated areas of New Orleans and forming communal projects. This is what I'm interested in. It's about practice, but we also have to have practice with an awakened mind. And I think that's what Buddhism is so good at teaching us.
I just want to add one comment to each of the questions. I don't think there's a separation between individual enlightenment and collective action. In fact, the idea that you can be separately, individually enlightened is an impediment to the possibility of enlightenment. I think there is a danger within the society of people who feel so what should I say, disempowered. They feel they have no sense of self. And there the idea would be to build the sense of self sufficiently enough to ultimately realize what the self really is, which is that it's not a substantive separate thing. And I really appreciate your point about the intersection between Marx's theory of ideology and Buddhism. If I were to do a fourth part, it would exactly be on the intersection of the Marxist theory of ideology and Buddhism. Because one of the points of this kind of resource is to cut through bourgeois ideology and a certain kind of socialist ideology that still clings to certain illusions.
One question, just also about the sense of self.
Louder.
What about the sense of self? Since the intellectual history of the past several hundred years has been sort of a decentering of the self. And the question is the end result of this process the end of the self or not, I guess. When we think of deconstruction, when we think of neuroscience, when we think of big data, when we think of cyborgs, is the self preserved throughout that or not? Is a question. It would be, and obviously some aspects of human development are preserved and some are not, but and I guess coming also from a Marxist Hegelian perspective where opposites in some sense are relative, what is the future of the self?
In my own limited experience with meditation, I found that like the experience of sort of watching your thoughts go by and separating that from myself from that has led me to have more of an experience of me as separate from being sort of whipped around by negative things that might come at me. And sort of the compassion of seeing myself for real, as opposed to like all the ways that you try to put yourself down, or I would try to put myself down from whatever, from my past. Like that has strengthened my sense of self and made me more able to work with other people. So to me, I see it more as you can't really combine up with other people collectively unless you have a better sense of self. Or it makes it easier to work collectively if you have a stronger sense of self and compassion towards yourself and then towards other people.
Yeah, so I was wondering if we should discuss a bit about the Dalit experience in India. I mean, the experience of the lower castes. And the fact that B.R. Ambedkar, the Dalit leader, actually converted to Buddhism towards the end of his life. And that could be considered a kind of leftist appropriation of Buddhism. That's one thing. And the other question I had was when does this comparison between Marx and Buddha or Marxism and Buddhism begin? Because it seems to me it has a pretty long history. So if you could enlighten us a little bit about the history of this comparison and how it evolved. Sorry. Because we are not the first person to do it, right? I mean, we are not comparing it for the first time. So these two sort of comments or questions or whatever.
Maybe we should take one other because we're running out of time.
Oh, I'm interested in kind of this Myanmar situation as a case study in a way of interdependence and, you know, codependent arising and sort of seeing through illusions. I mean, to say that it is a Buddhist movement that they're killing Muslims without, and I read the Buddhist so-called press about this either. There's no mention of these players at all. But with us here in the United States, particularly at the Left Forum, I mean, without even mentioning the US banks or British banks that are funding oil companies' exploration and also mining companies that are actually implementing primitive accumulation right there in Myanmar. And to just sort of say, well, it's Buddhist movement, they've gone wrong, without involving ourselves in it, because we live in a failed democracy. I mean, we're trying maybe in our own ways, but we're not in control of the banking system here. That is absolutely correct. We have to admit that for ourselves. And so I just wondered if you could comment on that. I mean, if we can at least start naming the players and seeing through the illusion as it's presented to us, we could begin maybe possibly to create a new form of action that could alleviate this kind of situation where people are actually killing other people because they're losing everything that they have, even the minimum of their ability to live and survive. And their children will go into sex industry. That is what happens in those countries when this happens to people when they're grown up.
We only have 2 or 3 more minutes on the panel. Yeah, I actually wanted to say something about where does the attempt to join Buddhism and Marxism begin. I don't think it's a huge movement right now. This is something people on this panel and other people are just beginning to attempt. In some sense, you could say it begins here, right now. People start thinking about it. And from my own sense of the possible intersection, I don't think it's a question of joining them as though we're creating new synthesis. I think it's a question of what might be called a kind of binocular vision, coming to the problem in both ways and seeing ways in which they can mutually support, mutually enrich, and also ways in which there are conflicts within them. I think all that's
I think if anyone wants to discuss Buddhism and radical politics, it's very important to know about traditions like Struhl and Sarvodaya movement and many other things, because there is a history there. And I think the importance, however, really is that we can learn so much. that we can learn from the various examples that have been given. I mean, we already covered this. Kill the Buddha. You know, there are times when you kill the Buddha. The word Buddhism is used to legitimate the most awful things. Everything is subject to distortion, misuse, delusion, to use a Buddhist term. But on the other hand, there is implicit in Buddhism something very liberating, something very revolutionary. And some people, there's a kind of liberation Buddhism, and some people have drawn on those traditions. That's what I'm interested in. That's what I'm interested in, those communities. We have a community called the Louisiana Himalaya Association in New Orleans, which now has about 25 people living in a small area. And it does work with refugees in India. What I want to see is that a more political, it also does work in people transforming their own lives, you know, to become more compassionate people. It's a very joyful community, which is another thing that's so important. When I come to the Left Forum, I don't find a lot of joyful communities. I really don't. One group I worked with was called Eco-Socialist Horizons, which is about the convergence between the ecological, socialism, anarchism, and so forth. And one of the things I love about it is that maybe not God, but spirituality is very important. Music is very important. They're inspired very much by a musician named Fred Poe, who just died recently, who was a great inspiration in his life and in his music. I think we have to, you know, Marcuse talked about the aesthetic dimension. You know, I think we have to ask a question, not only why are there too many white males, which is true, but why are there not enough musicians, artists? Why is there not singing, dancing? Why is there not art all around us? Why are we not paying attention to the personal dimension, the aesthetic dimension in everything we do? So I think the real question is, how can we awaken to many other things? In the Sarvodaya movement, there's the idea that there's personal awakening, family awakening, village awakening, national awakening, global awakening. The idea is, and you know, Martin Buber talked about this in Paths to Utopia. If we want to have a real human community, we have to have a community of communities. We can do this, by the way, in the Jewish tradition, many other traditions. The resources are there in every tradition, whether it's called a wisdom tradition, a philosophical tradition, a religious tradition, a spiritual tradition. The resources are there. Our question is, how can we achieve this? How can we create the community that can sustain us, give us a sense of joy, and help us move on to defend the earth and defend all human beings?
In fact, I really thank you. I think we all do.